So Tachidale, and welcome back. And we are now shifting gears just a little bit into a comparison between some of the Pali type texts and some of the Sanskrit type texts to see how those are similar or different. We're not going to go into a great deal of depth in that. The Dalai Lama has a book out that goes into some of that is very interesting, but we're going to be using the teachings of the Compassionate Buddha, which was first published in 1955 and then republished in the early 80s. And so it looks at the early discourses as well as the Dharmapada and then some of the later teachings. Some of these we've already taken a look at a little bit, so we won't spend much time looking at those. But this is very interesting to look at that. So we're going to focus primarily on the texts from the early writings, or the Pali Canon. We've been looking at that, so we have a pretty good feel for the flavor of the Pali Canon and so forth. So we'll look at some of the comments from the author here, who is E.A. Burtt, with two T's, and we'll look at some of the things that he has to say, some of his insights from a broader point of view, and then we'll look at some of the specific texts, as a part of that. So in that context, I wanted to start with some of his comments about this, which is a little bit redundant with where we started the course, but to help refresh your mind, and he does have a few views that are slightly different than what we talked about. So he begins talking here about India and the climate during the time when the Buddha was born. And the Vedas, particularly the Rig Veda, were very influential in much of India at that point in time. He says that generally speaking, a form of primitive religion, or this is, and the divinities and personified forces of nature are displayed in the sun, the earth, the rain, sacrificial fire, intoxicating libation, the sky, the wind, and so forth. So a lot of these things were incorporated and perceived as being a part of different, or personified in different ways as a part of that. But beginning about 800 BC, or BCE, we begin to see a shift in that. So that's still prior to the time of the Buddha. The Buddha is around 500, just to use a generic time frame. And so what that shift represents is the Upanishads. And previously we talked about that there were 2 or 3, maybe even 4 that were written before the time of the Buddha, a couple that were probably written during the time of the Buddha, but most of them actually after the time of the Buddha. And so the author here says that these writings are struggling to work out the mystical philosophy of the universe and human nature. And so in terms of that mystical philosophy, part of what he's talking about is experience and theological interpretations of that experience, and then leaving behind the separate, fearful, self-centered individual and becoming one with the universe and absolute reality, leaving behind the realm of unstable, transitory, and illusory. And so that helps give us a picture of the context for some of what was there at the time of the Buddha. Continuing on, he says that it's a remolding of the whole personality, a genuinely new birth, and it cannot be achieved suddenly, but only as a result of long and patient discipline. Its essence is liberation from attachment to the demands and longings that now hold us captive, and to the shrinking self that erects a protective wall of separation between itself and all other forms of life. And then he talks about the distinctive genius of Buddhism, he calls it, that can best be approached by a brief explanation of the fundamental concepts in which this mystical philosophy first gains expression in the Upanishads. Okay, so that's his reasoning for talking about that first. So these are some of the principles, and I think we've mentioned all of these before, but in case we'll go back through them again. The first is the concept of Brahman, and this is the metaphysical absolute. And we have similar kinds of concepts in the Buddhist tradition as well, particularly Vajrayana. Out of the Brahman come all things, to the Brahman all things return. So the idea is this absolute, and everything else emerges from that and then returns to that. So that part is a little bit different than what we would see in Buddhism, but there are some similarities there. The second principle is Atman, the soul or self. And here the true self of each human being is identical with Brahman. So there's a connection to that in that way. The crucial stage in the process of gaining realization is moksha. So that's a word that she has not used so much in Buddhism, but that's still, the idea of liberation is still a dominant principle in terms of Buddhism, which means release or liberation. And then this is with Brahman is the freeing of the self from the control by longings. So you can see a connection there too with the kind of things we've been looking at in the Pali Canon. And this then we have the death of the body, but the soul will survive in the event of and continue to exist, taking new forms one after the other until the purgation is complete. So this is reincarnation, is another principle here. And then this continued transmigration is samsara. Okay, so the karma, the idea of karma, reincarnation, and samsara are all linked into this. Actually, the next one here is karma. What determines the form that will be taken is the law of karma. The idea that principal causality operates in man's moral and spiritual experience in a particular way. So then the next one, so that's 6, and so the 7th one is dharma, another term we're familiar with, but it has a wide range of meanings. Even in Buddhism, there are multiple applications of the meaning there. And so the most general one is the way that a man should follow in order to fulfill his true nature and carry out his moral and social responsibilities. So this is the connection to the idea of the true nature and then behaving in a manner in accordance with that. The Buddha essentially accepted the ideas of moksha or liberation, samsara, and karma along with reincarnation. So those are ideas that the Buddha accepted. On the other hand, he rejected some of the others, like Brahman and Atman. Those in particular he rejected as a part of that. So Brahman is transformed rather than being rejected, however. And that goal is entrance into nirvana instead of union with Brahman. So he didn't just flat out reject these ideas, but he changed the meanings of them. We talked a little bit before about an arhat. So with moksha and liberation, somebody who's liberated was called an arhat, and particularly in the Shramana movement. And so he picked up that and he used that, but in a different way. The same thing with Brahman. He used Brahman as roughly equivalent of an arhat. And so that's not what it is in the Vedic tradition, but he did change those terms. So when we're reading those early texts, we have to be a little bit careful about the context and how they're being used. So the term Atman refers to a changeless and substantial self, so something that does not change, and so it would be permanent. Okay, and that's a part of it. And he also rejected this idea with no soul, anatman. Okay, so that is part of what he changed as a part of that. So the Buddha also accepted much, but not more of the framework that was being developed in the Upanishads at the time that he lived. The part that he doesn't talk about in this book is the Shramana movement. And so we know now that the Vedic movement, including the early Upanishads, were basically in the Indus Valley, which would be on the west side of India, and across primarily central India. The Shramana movement was primarily in East India and up along the Himalayas up into what is now northern Pakistan. But they didn't, I mean, it's not a hard and fast wall between the two. They overlap between the two. And so in the area where he lived, there would have certainly been some overlap between those. In the broader human situation, there are things like different wars going on. Remember, we talked about these as being little principalities, and so they're always fighting with each other. And rival clans, especially in northern India. The rigid caste system is a part of that. Now today we don't see the caste system as being as rigid at that point in time. We now know that when the British came into India, they are the ones that really reinforced the caste system as a way of manipulating the Indian population. And so that may be a little different than when this was originally written. And he talks about heavy and increasing emphasis on the correct performance of rite and ceremony. And I've mentioned that too in the Vedic tradition. That was part of what was going on. And there was an increasing degree of discontent about the way that that was being done. From Buddha's standpoint, religion was straying through these and other vices away from the insistent, poignant, and practical needs of men and women. It was not leading them toward true fulfillment and more dependable happiness. He conceived it as his task then to break through or sweep away these obstructive tangles. So, interesting way of putting it. And then to bring to India a saving message of light and love. So that gives it kind of a good overview in somewhat simplistic terms, but you can kind of see the relationship between those two in terms of how he used some of the ideas but also rejected and changed other ideas as a part of that. So then I'm going to skip over part of this that goes into more detail of things that we've already talked quite a bit about. And here he says that the last three steps are the fundamental conditions of a systematic process, and he's talking here in the context of Buddhism, the Four Noble Truths, including the Eightfold Noble Path, and they culminate in the achieved power of absolute concentration, by which the mind shows itself completely free from the sudden promptings and unpredictable flittings due to selfish craving. And the person who has reached this stage is no longer subject to rebirth. He enters nirvana, which is to be conceived not as sheer extinction. And sometimes we use the word extinction. I mean, he talked about it, and one of the metaphors he used was extinction, like when a candle burns out, uses up all the fuel. But as a naturally produced by the destruction of tanha. Tanha is a word that means selfish craving. So we're getting rid of that selfish craving, and we hear that a lot in the teachings. A state marked on positive side by a sense of liberation, inward peace and strength, insight into truth, the joy of complete oneness with reality, and love toward all creatures in the universe. That's really a pretty good summary of the kind of things that he taught as a part of that. So now we're going to look at some of the teachings that are a part of this. He does give the sermon at Varanasi, which was the one at Deer Park that he gave initially that we looked at previously, where he introduced the middle way, and he also talked about the Four Noble Truths and so forth. And then there's another one on the unanswerable questions that we also took a look at, so we're going to skip over that one as well. And there's one I thought I would just read a small part of. Is called Truth is Above Sectarian Dogmatism. Okay, so he's rejecting the idea of one particular absolute, this is the right way, which tends to be the way that the Vedas approach this. And so in the summary before it, the last part says, any supposed truth that cannot be spoken in love and inward peace is not truth. So that was kind of his dividing line between the kind of things that he was talking about. And here he says, apart from consciousness, no diverse truths exist. Mere sophistry declares this is true and that is false. Reminds me of Shakespeare, nothing that's right or wrong except thinking makes it so. Very same idea. So then there's one that talks about the Buddha dealing with a schism among his disciples and going through and makes an emphasis here on loving understanding, not quarreling with each other. As a part of that, at the very end of it, he says, enough, O bhikshus. No altercations, no contentions, no disunion, no quarrels. So why can't we all just get along? And then he does one here that is called the parable of the mustard seed. And in this one, two of the Buddha's most important doctrines are included. The first one of that is that everything in the realm of phenomenal existence is in change and is transitory. So that sounds pretty familiar. Everything is impermanent. The second one is the essential connection between a realistic acceptance of death and the realization of an ongoing compassion toward all living beings like ourselves. And so in this idea, we're talking about interdependence, that we are all interdependent with each other, and because of the connection that we have, we need to feel compassion for all of these other beings as part of that. And the idea of death, and we don't know for sure exactly what he said about death and what's after that point, because there are things that were one of the unanswerable questions, actually several of the unanswerable questions had to do with death, but in other cases he did things like in some of his first teachings he talked about some of his previous lives. Okay, so there's that element that's in there, and then there's the element that kind of indicates that maybe that's not a part of it. So that's not really clear as a part of this, but the basic idea is that there is that connection between the realization that we are all going to die. And so, at least in this lifetime, we need to pay attention to others and that feeling of compassion that we have for others, and that hopefully then they will do the kind of things that the Buddha taught with loving compassion and a compassionate oneness with all of humankind, if not all living being kind, if you will, as a part of that. There's another one here on universal love and goodwill, which kind of takes off from the previous one. And in this one, the essence of the spiritual realization in relation to unhappiness that precedes it is liberation. So we are able to overcome that unhappiness through liberation. It's dependably peace and bliss producing. The quality is love. By love, Buddha meant no dependent attachment to a person or object through whom one hopes to find his longings satisfied, but an unlimited self-giving compassion flowing freely toward all creatures that live. And so then it has this song basically that reflects that. The next one is the Buddha's farewell address. And so this is the one that happens at the time that he realizes that he is dying. And so the summary says, by the time the oral tradition became committed to writing, much material had accumulated about the Buddha's acts and sayings during the weeks preceding his death. Some of these seem out of harmony with each other, and it's difficult to decide which are most truly representative of his farewell teaching. So this following selection is one that he thinks brings out the most authentic note of all of these. And I just wanted to, this I'm sure you've heard before, but there's just one thing that I wanted to point out that's a part of this, that's kind of the key to the whole thing and is often repeated in terms of what his last message was. Therefore, Onanda, be lamps unto yourself, rely on yourselves, and do not rely on external help. Hold fast to the truth as a lamp. Seek salvation alone in the truth. Look not for assistance to anyone besides yourselves. And I would say presumably yourselves refers to the Sangha. And so you're looking at the other people with whom you are Sangha brothers and sisters to help each other along the path. The next section of the book goes back to the Dharmapada, and we looked at a number of the pieces from the Dharmapada as a way of that. In the introduction here, I just wanted to touch on a little bit of this without going back through a bunch of those, since we've already done that. So in this section, he calls the Way of Truth. This is this section on the Dharmapada. He talks a little bit about these and then gives a brief summary. And so I thought I would share that summary with you. He says, I bring great and good news. There is a way from the crushing miseries of this transitory life to real happiness, and it is open to all. But the way is hard, and there is no magical method of making it easy. It means strenuous and constant self-examination. It means renouncing all that you foolishly prize now, your present self, in fact, with all the ignorant cravings and blind urges that make it what it is. No one can tread this path for you. Neither God nor man, you must tread it for yourself. So begin now, be alert and steadfastly alert. Make the most sustained effort of which you are capable. Let nothing entice you to dally by the wayside. Neither self-indulgence, nor the mistaken urge to self-punishment, nor vain metaphysical curiosity, nor the desire for companionship with those not ready to enter upon the path. Face uncompromisingly toward the goal, and victory over self, the greatest of all victories, and the key to peace and joy in this life and beyond, will be won. So that's actually a pretty good summary right there of the overview. And in particular, I like the emphasis there about this is not easy. This is something that takes some effort and commitment in order to do that, because we tend in our culture to be rather impatient with things, and we want to jump right in, and we want the easiest way to get there, and so forth. And there are about 20,000 million books on the self-help section of every bookstore and library in the world and in this country that will certainly give you the right way to do that instantly. But that doesn't actually make it so. So then the next part of the text is the part that we're really going to focus on for the rest of today, which relates to the Theravada, or the Pali representation of some of these things. So he calls it the spirit of Theravada, even though he, like we have talked about before, recognizes that Theravada is just one branch of the early teachings, but it's the only one that's survived with enough information to really have a consistent view of what it is that they are teaching. So he begins, the major lands in which Theravada Buddhism prevails are Ceylon, which is now Sri Lanka, Burma, which is now Myanmar, and Thailand. From the viewpoint, there are actually some others in Southeast Asia as well. From the viewpoint of its thinkers, they are simply preserving its essential purity, the Buddhism taught by the master and practiced, as well as they were able to practice it by the early generations of his followers. And I think most scholars go along with that idea that that they taught this, they recorded it as best they understood it and as they thought that it was originally practiced. So I think that's true, in spite of the fact that there do appear to be some things that got shifted a little bit in the process. But they were still trying to do it the best way that they can, and I think that's a good way to view that. And then he goes on and says, however, it is possible that as Buddhism passed from its earliest form into that which has since prevailed in the Theravada countries, there has been at least a selection, an emphasis, and a tendency toward more extreme interpretation than that of the Buddha on several important points. And so that's a part, when you look at the arguments between the different traditions, that's part of it. And I mentioned before, it appears that even though there are things in the Pali Canon that read a lot like Mahayana, they seem to avoid those for the most part. Not exclusively, but their emphasis is on some of the other points of view. So then he continues on here, we are not dealing with the religion practiced by the masses of the people. So that's important to be aware of as well. These were recorded by monks primarily, and so that's their point of view. And he says it reflects an amalgam of the teachings of the respected leaders with popular superstitions. And so the culture also became incorporated into those. The vital area of continuity between Theravada and the original Buddhism lies mainly in the earnest, hopeful, and self-sufficient humanism that is so constantly displayed in the Dharmapada. And so, we looked at some of those, and so those are also suspected, at least by some scholars, to be among the earlier of the sayings that got written down, albeit in verse form. So that probably was changed from what his original teachings were as a mechanism to help in memorization. Pain and unhappiness constitute the great problem of life. The master found the essential solution to that problem by discovering the basic cause of suffering and how it can be brought under control. Our responsibility then is to follow him into the freedom of the homeless life. And so most of his followers then, the monks and the nuns, were following this yogi lifestyle, if you will, of the homeless life. And so they did not have permanent residences. And so we have a little bit of a division between the lifestyle of the monks and nuns, who originally did not have monasteries. They were traveling around, and they would, during the rainy season, hole up in camps, basically, and then after the rainy season, then they would go on venturing about. And then the lay practitioners, as the other group, would be like us, with households at places of more or less permanent residence. And so we had some different issues there, and we've talked about some of the differences from the earlier teachings between those two. And so the selections in here emphasize certain doctrines in which the Theravada Buddhism adopts an extreme position, rejecting the ideas that give comfort and security to the religion of the masses, and which in philosophic form have been defended by the theologies of Hinduism. These include the doctrines about nirvana and the transitoriness of all things. Popular religion in almost all ages and countries has longed for a blissful and peaceful existence after death. Hinduism has justified such longings by its conviction that there is a changeless Atman, permanent, the true self of each individual that ultimately is one with Brahman, the transcendent source of all reality. So that's how Hinduism deals with it. Christianity has a somewhat similar approach with going to heaven and being in a permanent form as a soul and so forth. So the Buddha seems to clarify clearly to have thought that nirvana is a state which is the natural and inevitable result of the extinction of craving. I mentioned that just a little bit earlier. That's the main focus then. And among the forms of craving that must be rooted out is the longing for a continued separate existence, anatman, no soul, in this life and the next. Did he go beyond this and teach that this state involves dissolution of conscious awareness as such? Did he say this is the final end? Or was he agnostic on this point? And that's like the questions, unanswerable questions kind of an approach. He aggressively was concentrating on the needed task of destroying through self-understanding whatever forms of craving still lurk in our makeup that many Theravada thinkers insisted on. They hold that the Buddha himself, for example, entered nirvana at the time of his enlightenment, a state in which he is still in the realm of the earthly existence, but no longer subject to its determining causes. And at his death, he passes into parinirvana, which means utter extinction, no longer participating in any describable form of existence, nor indeed of non-existence. So that gives a little point of view, but what he's summarizing here is the Theravada view of this, not Mahayana and Vajrayana, which we will get to a little bit later, particularly the Mahayana aspect of those. So the first of these that I wanted to just touch on is one that we actually looked at before, which is the fire sermon. And so part of this I wanted to do just to give you a sense of the difference in translation a little bit here. So in his introduction he says, the Buddha taught in his middle way that the body's functions should be respected as far as health requires, but that concern for them should not be allowed to obstruct single-minded progress toward liberation. The famous fire sermon expresses in vivid form one characteristic emphasis of the Theravada Buddhism on the need of turning away in utter aversion from everything in our nature which is on fire with craving, so that we may achieve a coolness of nirvana. So in this, I'm just going to summarizing a little bit of this. So he goes on and talks about the I, the forms, I consciousness, all of those are on fire, various impressions received by the I and so forth, the sensations that we have from these. What are they? They are the fire of passion, the fire of hatred, the fire of infatuation, birth, old age, death, sorrow, lamentation, misery, grief, and despair. Those are on fire. So we've seen that same list previously when we were looking at some of the other Pali ones. And so then he goes on, the ear, sounds, nose, odors, the tongue, tastes, the body. These things are tangible that are on fire. Mind and ideas, mind consciousness, impressions and so forth are also on fire. So all of these things that we experience in our lives, he refers to as things that are on fire that we need to address in order to transcend that and achieve this state of deep inner peace. So he says, perceiving this, the learned and noble disciple conceives an aversion. And then he goes through all of those lists again and again and again. And then he concludes by saying, in conceiving this aversion, he becomes divested of passion, becomes free. And when he is free, he becomes aware that he is free. And he knows that rebirth is exhausted, that he has lived the holy life, that he has done what it behooved him to do, and that he is no more for this world. So that's the basic idea that he was presenting here from a Theravada point of view, but it's also fairly similar with what we see in the other traditions as well. The next one is called On Health of the Mind. And I'm just going to touch on some of the elements of this one as well. And so here he says that an unlearned common person who is unskilled and untrained looks upon the body as his self. I am body, body is mine. The body of one possessed by this thought changes and becomes otherwise. We achieve grief, lamentation, pain, dejection, and despair that arise. He looks upon feeling as his self, and perception and aggregates as his self, and consciousness as his self. And again, grief, lamentation, pain, dejection, and despair arise. And so a learned noble disciple, and we've seen that term or something very similar to that previously, then, so for comparison with the unlearned common person, now we have the learned noble disciple, is skilled and well trained, does not look upon his body as his self, and grief, lamentation, pain, dejection, despair do not arise. And so he continues on and says he does not look upon consciousness as his self, and goes through, again, all of these lists as a part of that. So we'll take a little break right here.